There we go. Okay, so we will get started. If you have questions while this is going, please feel free to use the chat box. You can also, you know, there's going to be a couple points where I kind of ask opinions, and feel free to also unmute your mic if you would rather share that way. There are going to be 2 or 3 points in this workshop where we do kind of like free writing. So you probably want to have something to write with at hand too. So that can be pen and paper. If you're on your computer or a tablet, your phone, you can jot down notes in that too. Whatever's convenient for you. You just probably want to think about getting that going. Okay, so we'll start. This is from research to writing, planning and organizing your research. I'm Dr. Jillian Azevedo. You see my email address there, and I'm with the University Writing Program. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna close this. Sorry, if I have boxes open on my screen, I believe they block your view. So I'm trying to move stuff around so that you can have the full view of the PowerPoint. So I'm kind of thinking about where this kind of workshop came from. It's that point where you've done your research and you kind of knew what you maybe were going to do there, how to tackle that. And now it's now what? Now what are you doing? Okay, so you've done your research, now what? There we go. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with Kate Turabian. She is one of the authors for a manual for writers of research papers, theses, dissertations for Chicago style. This is from the 8th edition, but there's several editions after that. So I think this is kind of an idea that we can all relate to, right? I'll read the quote. This may be the time to address a problem that afflicts even experienced researchers, and at some point will probably afflict you. As you shuffle through hundreds of notes and a dozen lines of thought, you start feeling that you're not just spinning your wheels, but spiraling down into a black hole of confusion, paralyzed by what seems to be an increasingly complex and ultimately unmanageable task, right? The bad news is that there's no sure way to avoid such moments. The good news is that most of us have them and they usually pass. Yours will too if you keep moving along, following your plan. Take on a small manageable task instead of trying to confront the complexity of the whole project. And this kind of normal panic is another reason to start early, to break a big project into smaller steps, and to set achievable deadlines such as daily page quotas when you draft. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for this workshop, right? There's this very normal, very real moment of panic where you're kind of transitioning, and how can we manage that? Okay. Let's see. There we go. So for some of you, you have a stack of notes. Some of you may still be in the process of wrapping up your research. And so this part kind of can apply to kind of like that. You're finishing the research stage and also when you're trying to organize everything you have. So my advice is to try to think ahead for what will be helpful in the future. And one important piece of that is make sure you have bibliographic information. Many of us can attest to finding some piece of research that while we're kind of combing back through our notes, and we're like, oh, this would be super helpful in some particular way, but we don't have a citation listed for it or the important bibliographic information that we're going to need. And then you can waste hours, right, trying to find that information, recreating your research. Okay, I'm going to jump down to the last point on this slide. Notate in some way when you're quoting directly from the source. That's also a really important thing to do while you're going through research and recording things. Sometimes we write down, we're just in such a kind of like an information gathering stage that we write down important facts, quotes, statistics, details, right? And we'll write them down word from word from where we encountered them. So from whatever source we're looking at. But if we don't very clearly indicate to ourselves somehow that that is a direct quote, when we go to write later, sometimes we will look at our notes and be like, wow, I was great when I was taking notes. I was very eloquent. I was putting, making a lot of sense. And so if you copy from the source directly into your notes, and then without knowing it, copy from your notes directly into your work, you've just plagiarized, right? And it's a very, I don't want to say easy, but it's a very kind of like, it is easy, right? Because you just didn't even know that that's what happened. So make sure you notate to yourself somehow if you're directly quoting from some source. Okay, so back up to that second point. If you're kind of somehow creating like one large document for your notes, can you include search words that will help you find things later? And sometimes this is just a matter of you referring to something similarly throughout, right? So making the conscious decision whenever you refer to. So I'm going to inadvertently use my own dissertation research as an example. So just so you understand why I'm doing that. My dissertation was on foreign foods in 17th century England, okay? So making sure that I was very consistent about, calling, yes, calling the same food item the same thing throughout, but also sometimes with what I was doing, the spelling would change from source to source. So making sure I was very intentional about spelling things correctly so I could look things up later, right? Or somehow just giving myself like a cheat sheet of words that I knew I could look up later, right? And so I at first took all my notes, pen and paper, and then I transcribed all of those over to a Google Doc, I believe, so that it was easier to search. You can also categorize by what it implies or by a larger idea. If you kind of already are breaking your project apart, you can categorize by areas that you think the work fits into, right? Also try to include your own thoughts in your notes, especially those you may not remember later. And you can devise a system for that, right? It's kind of like those side notes. You can color code that, you can do that using a variety of ways, right? But kind of trying to capture that moment in your thought process, okay? All of these things are good. It seems tedious, but I do think that going back through your notes, kind of before you start writing again and just reviewing everything you have is a good idea. Okay, so there's different ways to kind of organize your research to help you before you write. There's the traditional outline, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's, if you were to make an outline in Microsoft Word, Google Docs, something like that, and you had it use the outline feature, you would start with Roman numeral 1. The next line would be, I think, uppercase A, and then you go to Arabic numeral 1, lowercase a, right? That kind of very straightforward outline, right? Some people's brains, that's the thing that works the best, right? I know that's how most of the time my brain tends to work. I like that kind of very structured, linear outline. What if that doesn't work for you? There's other things. It's not on this slide, but there's what we call mind maps. And you can Google that if you want to, but it's very much, I don't know if I'm the only person that did this. I remember doing these in like elementary school, where we would like make pictures out of them, but you kind of start with a summer bubble and then you do like spokes off a wheel, right? And it does kind of create like this mapped image, okay? Another idea, and this one may be a little bit new to you, I had heard of it before, but applying it to an academic setting, that was kind of new to me, is a storyboard, okay? So it's similar to an outline, but it can spread across several pages so you can add evidence, ideas along the way, right? And there's this picture off to the side of somebody who's done it on a cork board. And obviously if it spans pages or, you could have a larger cork board and you could envision it kind of like pulling out, right? And being this kind of longer, elaborate thing. The important part about this is that points on a storyboard should be movable, okay? Some people find this very liberating since it's not fixed, right? So you can move things around if you're still debating organization, if you're still trying to figure out where things fit the best, okay? You can also spread pages across a wall, which I'll show you an example of in a minute. Group similar pages together, cluster minor ideas under major ones, all these kinds of things, right? With the idea being that it's movable, some people, like I said, find a lot of freedom in being able to test their ideas, right? And not, you wrote it down on a page and now you have to start all over. So if you were to build a storyboard, things to think about: at the top, the center of your storyboard, write out your question, your working hypothesis, your thesis, your topic, right? This could be for your whole dissertation. This could be for an article. This could be for a chapter. This could be a subpart of either an article or a chapter, whatever works for you, okay? And then on separate pages, or separate note cards, you would write reasons, statements of proof that support that idea. So now you're breaking down that idea, okay? And I think something that's really helpful in this is thinking about explaining your research topic to a stranger in an elevator, right? If someone asks you, who's outside of your field, who's outside of academia, a question about your topic, you want to answer that question, but succinctly and concisely, right? Because they probably didn't want the long answer. They want the short, concise answer. And I think for outlines, that's really helpful too. Like breaking down each idea into that short answer, and thinking and then piecing it down part by part, okay? And then you can, beneath that, add the evidence that you have, okay? And the cool thing about a storyboard is you're able to step back and look at the whole. And like I said, move things around, okay? So this sounds weird, I get that. So I have two examples for you to hopefully help you kind of like visualize this a little bit more. I don't know if any of you know Sarah VOWELL. She came to our campus several years ago and she talked about her writing process. And this is from that interview, I believe. She's done a lot of stuff. I believe she used to be a frequent host, or not host, a frequent kind of guest on the Daily Show. But she's written a variety of books. So she, when she was talking about going from research to writing, said this: so the way I come to writing structurally is, before I start, I gather all of my research, every quotation, every historic event, every idea. I call them shenanigans, just some random like fun facts. and each one of those things gets its own index card. Then I sit on my living room rug for a few weeks and move these cards around. I don't know, it would be nice if I did all of that on my computer. I think there are computer programs that basically do the same thing, I've heard. But it's kind of like, you know, that moment in a cop show when the cops break into the serial killer's apartment and they see that wall, you know, with all the photos and the strings tying photos together and the questions. It's kind of like that. It's very excessive looking, and I can see why, if it was just all on a computer file, no one would ever know. One time I was in the middle of index card month and my super had come to fix my air conditioner and I couldn't move the cards. The cards were not in the right place yet, and he came in and saw all these cards covering the living room rug, and he had to step over them and around them. So I think this gives you a really clear idea of how one person has done it, right? So instead of kind of like the cork board, which we had a picture of on the last slide, she has index cards arranged all over the floor, right? And again, one of the things that she's finding liberating is the fact that she can move them around. You know, when her super comes, she's a little landlocked because they're not in the right spot yet. But the idea is that, like, she has everything and she can move them around, and that's very helpful to her. Okay. So my own, I think the next one, yes. So this is my own personal example. I loved Sarah Vowell's idea of index cards. I didn't love the idea of them on the floor. I have pets. That just sounded like a nightmare. But I did have an open wall, okay? So this is when I was up for review for, you know, one of my personnel files. So you see at the top all these different classes that I've taught, right? And so but I did the same thing with sticky notes. I color coded the sticky notes by class just because I like things that are aesthetically matching. So obviously that wouldn't be a necessity for someone else, but I did move these around, right? You wouldn't know based on the color matching scheme, but and it was really helpful for me because I had massive writer's block. I had no idea where to start, and it was helpful to be able to put everything up on the wall and move things around. And for me, I could leave it up there and not worry about someone stepping on them on the ground, okay? So things to think about, right? Ways to kind of create an outline that help you overcome writer's block, right? So if you are a visual person, if you're a person who wants to, you know, be able to move things around and not have such a static outline, maybe something like this is helpful, okay? So for our first free write, take a few minutes and see if you can sketch a storyboard for whatever topic you're working on. And again, you could do the whole dissertation, the whole thesis that you're working on. You could break it down into a chapter or a subpart. If you're thinking more in terms of an article, you could work on that. And I know this is hard to do on the fly, so I'm only going to give you a few minutes to see kind of like just more testing, like what you think of this whole idea of a storyboard. Okay, so it is, I have 1:23 right now. Give you 2 to 3 minutes to work on this, and then we'll come together and discuss it a little bit more. Okay, if you want to take 30 seconds or so to finish what you're writing. Okay, so from that, and also basically, you know, what you were thinking about before, maybe, what do you think? And you can respond in the chat box, you can unmute your mic. What do you guys think of this idea? Is it more helpful than a traditional outline? Are you more of a fan of a traditional outline? What do you think? And also, if you're thinking about a storyboard, do you think trying to construct something on a computer using a program would be more helpful, or do you like this index cards idea? What do you think about all of this? So I'm in the chat box is fine, or someone wants to unmute. Okay, we have one. I like the the index cards. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So Abby says it seems really helpful in the beginning, and then maybe a more formal outline. I agree. So sometimes for me, that formal outline, I don't know why, but if I'm having massive writer's block, it's hard for me to sit down and write. But if I'm writing, it's easier for me to write from one of those. So I do kind of do both. More than one. Okay, so Zane says my thesis is a intersection of more than one discipline. How does one prioritize or change a two-dimensional outline into a one-dimensional linear written thing? I think those are kind of like judgment calls, right? And honestly, I think that's sometimes why the spokes on the wheel thing is helpful too, because I think with a linear outline, we kind of assume that certain things are taking precedence over others, and that's not always the case, right? And so I think that is helpful. And that might be something to talk to like a PI about or an advisor. I've written out these things. How do I make them fit all together? Yeah, it's a lot of people saying they can see themselves relying more on a traditional outline as they develop more. And I personally feel the same way. But it was really interesting for me to think about, especially as I was writing my dissertation, because sometimes it's just like you've just hit a wall and you don't know what to do. And so I think these kind of like different ways of thinking about things can help. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so this might kind of touch on the idea of having topics that are kind of like interdisciplinary. So thinking about key concepts to create coherence throughout your document. Let me pull up the chat line again. So Sarah just said there's a free program called Trello that has a similar organization style, cards and to-do lists. Perfect. That's super helpful, especially the free part, right? So yeah, if the storyboard idea is something that interests you, check that out. So thinking about our topics, you'll likely have key concepts that run through your research, but readers won't always be able to spot them if you're not remaining consistent with the wording. So again, being very deliberate about what you're naming things, how you're terming things, right? What are the key concepts? How do you want ideas to relate? Can you use the same terminology throughout your work so that you're making things very clear? Try to avoid obvious words when thinking about these, and focus on concepts you're bringing to the project. So what you're adding, right? When you're writing a dissertation, when you're writing a thesis, even when you're writing up an article, right? You're bringing some new knowledge or some new idea to the academic world, right? And focus on concepts that kind of encapsulate that, right? So what can you use that can consistently kind of remind readers about that? Okay, and then try to limit your concepts to just a phrase or a few words. I'll admit one with mine was a little bit longer, but it worked, right? And I think I kept using it enough that it hammered home the point to readers, even when I was doing things within different disciplines, right? There were points where I was looking at foreign foods as they were popping up in like plays versus foreign foods as they were popping up in cookbooks, with plays kind of taking more of a literary English slant, right? But the ideas were the same, right? And so those core concepts were the same, and I could kind of like tie everything together by focusing on those key concepts, okay? And then you can also do this for subparts, right? So if you've thought about how to tie everything together, on the larger level, the whole project, how can you break things down into smaller parts within chapters, within sections? Okay, so again, dividing up your project. Based on your project, its genre, audience, can you divide it into parts, right? And that genre awareness and audience awareness is super important, right? Because the reader comes to your project with certain expectations, right? If they're reading a lit review, right, that's a particular genre, they have specific expectations. There's things that they just assume a lit review will present to them, and they expect you to kind of do that. Same thing with a dissertation, right? There's thoughts about length, thoughts about structure, that it will be divided into chapters, things like that, right? And then also your audience. You know, dissertations are generally written for that kind of academic audience. If you're writing an article, think about the journal or the place of publication that you're writing for. Who is their audience, right? Because that can really influence what the reader expects and then how you should proceed in structuring your document, okay? If we think about something like a chapter, you could think, you know, or I'm sorry, you think about your dissertation, right? You would think that it's broken down into several chapters. And then within that, there's probably several sections, right? And then within that, there might be several subsections. So sometimes breaking down, kind of going back to that first idea about we have these unmanageable tasks. Sometimes unmanageable tasks can become manageable if we just break them down into small enough parts, right? So when I have my undergrads and I'm asking them to write, you know, a 10-page paper, sometimes I'll get students who say, I've never written a paper this long. I'm used to papers that are like 3 pages long. Well, a 10-page paper is, you could think about it as a series of 2 to 3 page papers, right? We have an introduction and then you break it down by sections that are shorter, right? And so if you take on those shorter sections, sometimes that's easier to wrap your brain around than the whole piece, right? So if, you know, writing a 20 or 30 page article doesn't sound that daunting to you, but writing a 200 or 300 page dissertation does, maybe think about your project in terms of chapter by chapter, right? Don't necessarily think about you're taking on the whole project at once. Think about the chapter, right? And again, if the chapter seems too daunting, can you break it down into sections, right? That may be more manageable based on what you're used to writing, okay? So this brings us to starting a draft. And writers draft in very different ways. So again, this is from Turabian, but I think it's really helpful. So writers draft in different ways. Some are slow and careful. They have to get every paragraph right before they start the next one, okay? So to do that, they need a meticulous plan. So if you are a slow drafter, you'll want to plan carefully. Other writers let the words flow, skipping ahead when they get stuck, omitting quotations, statistics, and so on that they can plug in later. If they are stopped by a stylistic issue, such as whether to represent numbers in words or numerals, they insert a question mark and keep going until they run out of gas, and then they go back and kind of fill in the blank. Quick drafters need lots of time to revise, though. So if you know that about yourself, you want to start early. And I think there's a couple ideas that are really important that stick out in this. Part of this is knowing what kind of writer you are and not fighting that, okay? And not thinking, I think it's harder to become the writer that maybe your peers are or become the writer that you think most people are than to just go with what works for you, okay? So if you're a slow drafter and that's how your brain works, just go with it, right? And plan accordingly, okay? I think I'm more of a slow drafter. If I don't love something, I can push myself to get through it, but I cannot omit quotations. I can't omit citations. I can't put a question mark and plug in things later. That just doesn't sit right with me. And it bugs me to the point that I get distracted, right? So I know that about myself, and instead of thinking, oh, this process would be so much faster if I could just go, I I work with what I know about myself, okay? So learning yourself, I think, is really important, and not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? You've got this far based on the writer that you are. Just maybe embracing it is better than trying to change habits that, it's not that the habits are unproductive, it's just that, you know, sometimes we think, oh, this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing, you know? Some people think, oh, I should get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write. And if that works for them, that's great. I guarantee you it's not going to work for me. Instead of forcing myself to try to work at 5 o'clock in the morning, coming up with something realistic that fits for me makes much more sense. Okay. The other thing that I think this kind of points out is what is a draft, right? And I think sometimes we get stuck in this spot where we think the drafts have to be almost perfect, right? And so that's, I think, the one downfall with slow drafting. If we're overly critical on ourselves as we draft, that can be crippling too. And so in my first year composition course, when I'm trying to get, you know, first, second year students to overcome writer's block, I have them read this article by Anne Lamott that's called Shitty First Drafts. It's really short. You could read it if you want to. It's I think it's an interesting piece, but the moral of the story is that first drafts are supposed to be bad, right? And so there is something liberating in the quick drafters, kind of just, let's just get things on the page and work with it later. Because having something to work with as a draft is better than having nothing to work with as a draft. So I think that's, you know, one important thing to think about if you're a slow drafter, right? Don't be so meticulous that it's keeping you from writing, okay? Something is better than nothing. And first drafts, as Anne Lamott points out in that article, are supposed to be kind of garbage, right? You're supposed to revise them. So another point that we're going to free write, think about it. What kind of drafter are you? And are you happy with your drafting process? Do you think something else might be productive? So kind of self-reflection. What kind of drafter are you? How do you write? What are your writing habits? What works? What doesn't work? And are you happy with the process? Or do you think something else would be better? I'll give you 4-ish minutes or so, 4 to 5 minutes to think about this. Okay, take about 30 seconds to wrap up what you're writing. There's a couple points of discussion that have come through on the chat, so we'll start there. But it sounds like some really good kind of like self-analysis is taking place, which is awesome. Okay, so the idea is to come back and discuss kind of like what are your productive draft habits, and then are there other draft habits that you've heard of. So I'm kind of going to go through the couple comments that we've received and talk about things. And then if you have something to add to any of the individuals that you think might help, feel free to chime in, right? Because that's part of what this is. I think learning about how other people write and draft actually helps us a lot too, right? Because sometimes we think, I would never thought of doing that, and then it helps. And then, you know, the example that I gave of the Post-its on the wall was kind of a combination of Sarah Vowell, but then also when I was in grad school, I had a friend who, I don't know how she got a hold of it, but you know that like big butcher sheet paper that sometimes we'd like use in schools? She covered an entire wall of her tiny studio apartment and just wrote all over it. And I remember looking at it in grad school and thinking that would drive me absolutely insane. But I was kind of like later when I was stuck inspired by it, and I came to something that would help me in my own way. So listening to other people, I think helps us, even when we think that wouldn't really work for me, it might spark something that would. Okay, so going up to Keith's comment, So kind of, we're going to touch on this more in a couple slides, but thinking about how your drafting style fits with your advisor's expectations, right? And I think that's a very real, I don't want to say problem, but right, like that's a very real thing to consider. I think that if you know what their expectations are, sometimes you can try to work with the kind of writer that you are, right? So if they're thinking, I want to see a chapter a month, right? Or an article a month or something like that, something of that length, you might be able to work out how you can still be a slow drafter within that time frame, right? And it might mean that you're doing something every day and not waiting until a couple, like 2 weeks out, right? That might be a way. There's also, I mean, if your advisor has expectations that, you know, I want to see something every week, that may not fit with the kind of like, oh, I'll just budget more time for it. There might not, you know, there's only so many hours in the day. I think you can be honest with them. And then also, you know, think about the idea that maybe if you're a slow drafter and that's not what they want, you could also have a conversation about like, maybe it's going to be a series of drafts that you see, right? Instead of just one, right? And again, this might not align perfectly with their expectations, but it might be more, if they're after progress, if they're after seeing progress, the idea of a series of drafts instead of I'll give you one draft, you'll make comments, I'll give you a next draft and we'll be done, right? And if you kind of start this idea that it might be a series of drafts. So the next one is a slow drafter, and I'm not happy about it, again, because of time constraints. I struggle with perfectionism. Interested in finding out where I can adjust. And so anybody can kind of like jump in if they can scroll in the chat box. If they think that they kind of have tools for overcoming this perfectionism. I think this is probably something that a lot of us have. I think it's just, you know, when you're in grad school, this is something that it's like one of those normal struggles, right? That a lot of us deal with. I know for me, I can get caught in a loop of deleting, right? Where I'm like, I write a sentence and I'm like, that's garbage, delete, right? Another sentence, that's extra garbage, and I delete, right? And you do this for 10 or 15 minutes, and then you think about that sentence you wrote 10 minutes ago, and you're like, maybe that wasn't actually garbage. So sometimes for me, I will have two separate documents up on the screen. And instead of deleting, I copy and paste the garbage into a separate document that I'm not working on at the moment. And it doesn't make sense, right? It's just copy and pasted a paragraph here, a sentence there, two sentences here, right? And I could, because I can't have it on my screen, I can't have it in the document that I'm working on because I think it's garbage at the moment, but maybe there's something redeemable about it that I can come back to, right? And that has helped me a lot. It breaks that everything I write is garbage. Trying to turn the editor in your brain off is difficult, right? And so sometimes if you're able to just let yourself write and ignore even sentence level things, right? Like, I'm just gonna write, and if I write run-on sentences, I can figure those out later. I'm just gonna write, and if I'm using the same word over and over and it's becoming repetitive, I'm gonna fight the urge to look things up in a thesaurus. I can do that during the draft, right? And so sometimes trust me, I know that that's a very hard skill. That's something I struggle with too, but I think turning off the editor voice in your brain can be helpful at points. So the next one is, Abby says, I fall somewhere in between. I'm okay with generally writing insert citation later, moving on, but getting caught up in sentence flow and structure. They need to look good before moving on. Yeah, I mean, I think that again, is trying to turn the editor off. I have literally sat at my computer, I have vivid memories of this, and typed, and I'm like shaking my head no as I'm typing, because I'm like, this is garbage. And I have also gotten to the point where sometimes I will, in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, write comments in the side like, this is not good. And I got that idea from a friend in grad school who also, that was the only way she could keep going, is she would highlight a sentence and be like, please fix me. She'd write that in the comment. So that there was something to her that was freeing about owning that I need to come back to this, but then also allowing her the space to move on. So checking that editor voice in your head is important. So the next one, I'm a quick drafter, but I've created a habit of, I'll add this in later, to the point where it builds and that list gets too long. Draft 1 is ideas, draft 2 maybe filling in, draft 3. Yeah, so again, it's that idea of several drafts. And also, I mean, another thing that I found very helpful with my advisor on certain projects was so instead of going back to the same document and revising, every time I gave him something, I created a new document, so that there were certain things where I had, and my prospectus, I think I had like 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, right? And so that I could track changes and I could see where I had gone, and we could kind of go back, right? There were points where it was interesting for both of us to kind of think like, well, wait, wasn't the original thought this? Sometimes that's helpful too. I know in Google Docs you can track changes. So, you know, you might not need to do all the subsequent documents, but sometimes that's helpful too, right? Because at least you're acknowledging for yourself the path, the improvements that you've gone through. And Natalia says, I'm probably a pretty fast drafter. I never delete. It goes to the bottom of the document. Exactly. It's that idea of turning off the editor. And I keep saying that, and it sounds so easy. I know it's so difficult. And oftentimes we're our own worst critics in writing. So it's especially difficult. But trying to break out of that, where you're just getting things on the paper and not editing. I can't do it completely. Well, maybe someday I can. I can't do it completely, but I can pull myself back. If I can tell I'm being too much like an editor, I can check myself. And it's just kind of these habits that you start to develop, right? But it's tough. And I like that we're saying too that like there's drawbacks to both, to being a fast drafter and a slow drafter, right? And so no one's writing process is perfect. Part of it is learning you and your process and how you write and working with that, right? Obviously there's time constraints, advisor expectations, things like that, you know, influence this in ways sometimes we wish wouldn't. But I was going to say that's what makes it fun. It's not what makes it fun, but it's what makes it interesting. How about that? It's what makes it interesting. So kind of going on that idea, the next thing I think we can think about is factors to consider when making a schedule. So you have hard deadlines, okay? And those hard deadlines are when it's due. So if you're trying to submit a dissertation or a thesis, are there like quarter deadlines that it has to be turned in by, right? If you're writing it for a class, what are those deadlines? If you're turning in an article, are there deadlines for that? If you're writing a conference paper, when do you need to have that done by? Those are hard deadlines. And then I would also include in hard deadlines what your advisor or your PI expects, right? Some of us have relationships with an advisor or a PI where if we have a conversation with them and talk about a deadline, it's fluid and they understand that. I didn't have that relationship with my advisor. And so for me personally, if he was expecting something, I was pretty darn sure I was going to get it to him at that time, right? That's just the relationship we had. And so you can kind of think about where you would want to put like their expectations. Is that a hard deadline, or is that kind of more of a self-imposed deadline? But also think about, is the deadline that you're thinking of when you need to be done or when you need to have a draft, right? So that can influence the advisor, PI, deadlines too, right? Are they expecting a draft at a certain point or to be done at a certain point? And if it's done, you have to back up and think about, you need time to revise and or proofread before that done time, right? So kind of factor that in. What other factors will affect your progress? So work. Are you doing things besides working on this, right? For me, I was a teaching assistant throughout all of grad school, right? So I needed to think about when my students were doing things, when they were submitting finals, when they were submitting midterms, when they were submitting papers, right? Are there family obligations, right? You know, that are going to, again, you know, I know people with kids, especially young kids, think I'm going to get up early and block out this amount of time before everyone wakes up because otherwise I won't get it done. Right, kind of like those factors that will affect your progress, right? That you only have like a limited amount of time each day, maybe you have a freer schedule, and then also lifestyle. Some people can work every day for hours and hours every day on something and never get burnt out. I personally am not one of those people. My brain just needs to just I call it be jello. My brain just needs to be jello for a little bit every day, right? I need to not think about serious things for a little bit every day, right? And so I need to factor that into my schedule, okay? So on the next slide, it says draft a realistic schedule. And I want to give you guys just a few minutes to do that, or at least jot down the things you should think about when you're drafting a realistic schedule. The thing that I will ask you as you start this is probably like a rhetorical question, but how hard are you going to be on yourself if you create deadlines and then you can't meet them, right? I'm a person that even if no one expected me to finish by a certain day except for me, I get very annoyed with myself if I can't meet my self-imposed deadlines. Even if I'm sick, even if, you know, a catastrophe happened, I get annoyed with myself, right? So when I craft a schedule, I need a schedule that I've allowed for things to go terribly wrong and I can still meet that deadline for my sanity, right? I know people who are much easier on themselves and more understanding with themselves, and they think, well, no, I'll just come up with a schedule, and if something happens and I can't make it, that's fine, I get it. So think about who you are and how you talk to yourself too when you're thinking about these schedules. So for me, when I was in grad school, I figured, okay, realistically, I can probably knock out a chapter after I'd finished all the research. When it was just writing, I can probably knock out a chapter every 2 weeks. But because I know that mentally it's going to be hard for me to process if I can't keep to my deadlines, even though they're self-imposed deadlines, I'm going to give myself a month. So a chapter a month, right? And if I can go faster, fantastic, right? But I will hold myself to that. So as you kind of think about a realistic schedule, think about who you are too, okay? So just a minute or two, I'll give you about 2 minutes. And again, if you don't have a full schedule thought out, what are things you think you should consider when you're making this schedule? Okay. Anybody else have anything that they kind of thought of about scheduling while they were doing this. Scheduling can be really personal, so I'm not gonna like force, you know, participation here, but anything that I missed that people feel like, oh, this is another huge aspect of scheduling. I know that, you know, being a parent has a lot to do with it. So parents out there might be thinking, and right now with COVID, if you are a parent and your child is at home, that could be really fun scheduling wise, trying to do your own work too. Making sure that committee members will have time. Yes, that's important too. Yeah, we'll actually have time to review. And Abby, thanks for bringing that up, because I think another important thing too is that because we're so focused on our advisors, I think sometimes we think that like we'll work off their schedule and then it should work with everybody else, but kind of early on touching base with them and seeing what they want and how much time they'd like to review things. Do they want to be part of the process the whole way through? Do they just want to read it at the end? That's really important. And sometimes I think we forget about it in the beginning, or even in the middle. And then we get to the end and we're like working up against deadlines. And then I think that's a point of anxiety, right? You gave them a document and now maybe they're like, well, I needed more time to read this, right? Yeah, so thinking about your community members, not just your advisor. Absolutely, that's a great point. I think it's that point where we're so close to the end that we're like, it's just one of those things that slips your mind, but that is very important too. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so how are you going to stay on track, right? You've created the schedule for yourself. How do you hold yourself accountable? So obviously some of us are better at holding ourselves accountable. Some of us are kinder to our, you know, when we talk to ourselves than others. So there's a couple different ways. There's a dissertation writing group, and I'm going to walk you through it. And trust me, I hear dissertation writing groups are one of those things that when I was writing my dissertation, I was like, I don't need this. And now I'm afterwards, after I've gotten through it, like it probably would have been helpful. And in some ways where I did do something like this, it was very helpful. So hear me out. So this dissertation writing group is a group that you devise that helps you. I think that's the most important thing. It's you and however many other people. I think smaller groups tend to work better. And you guys kind of set the rules, right? So there's no right or wrong way to do this. Part of it is support, right? Part of it is not that they're going to be able to fact check things for you, but part of it is that you're going to have, you know, a peer to commiserate with about writer's block, or about sending your advisor a draft and not getting a response back. Kind of like some of the things that we all go through during this process. It also helps keep you accountable, right? If you vocalize, I'm going to do this by X time, and then you don't, even if that's a self-imposed deadline, you're still kind of explaining to somebody why you didn't do it, okay? Creates a sense of community, right? I feel like there's a lot about this research and writing process that's very, I don't want to say lonely, because I don't know if that's the right word, but it's very individualistic, and a community helps. Facilitates peer feedback, right? Sometimes your peers can help you in things like, I don't understand this idea that you're presenting, or, you know, I read this sentence like this, is that how you meant it? Those kind of things. Encourages idea development, and honestly can help you better understand yourself as a writer. I think the support aspect of a dissertation writing group is super important. I think the camaraderie that I'm going through this with somebody else, and we all have struggles. I think that's very good for us. And then I'm also a huge believer in sometimes you don't need someone to have the answers for you. You just need the space to talk out the problem and you'll figure out the answer yourself, right? And so while a writing group may work, sometimes just having a person, right? Maybe like someone in your department or someone in your field who you can just talk to, right? I'm trying to figure out how to organize this chapter. I could do it like this, but the shortfall to that is blah, blah, blah. Could do it like that, but I don't know if this is going to transfer that well. But maybe if I established this before I started getting too far in writing, you know, sometimes you can talk your way into an answer. All you needed was them to listen. And honestly, I think sometimes we could just talk to ourselves. Just don't think that many of us feel comfortable doing it, right? So having someone who listens and is like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, I could see how that would work. That's super important, right? So I remember thinking about dissertation writing groups. You know, no one else is doing the exact same kind of research that I am. And I think that that isn't necessary, right? So things to think about. So could it work for you? If not, would something similar be helpful? This is, honestly, I think this is something that I'm going to leave you with to sit with, because I think some people love this idea off the bat. Some people have to grow on them. Some people, you know, don't love the idea of a group, but they can think of a person that they could say, hey, what if like every week or every 2 weeks we did a Zoom call, or in pre or post COVID times, we got coffee and we just kind of like updated each other on what we're doing, right? So there's different iterations of this, but it's just something to think about, okay? The other thing to think about, and I don't know if you know about this, is that graduate writing with WAC and the University Writing Program has set up graduate writing consultations. And they're to help at any stage of the writing process, from getting started to working on drafts. And so you'll work with a grad writing consultant, and they could almost be this person, right? That you go and talk to if you're stuck. Because like it says, it's for any stage of the writing process. So they'll help if you're trying to talk through organization, if you're trying to work out, you know, the coherence in a paragraph, stuff like that. They're not line editors, so it's not like you take them something and they mark it up and give it back to you. But it is definitely this way of kind of like helping you move through your own drafts, think things through. Graduate level seminar papers, portions of a thesis or dissertation, a journal article, grant proposal, abstract, conference proposals, conference talks, etc., right? They don't really have a limit on what kind of writing to help you with, right? So if you're interested, they are still doing these remotely. I think they might have been doing them remotely before COVID. So if we get back to a place of normalcy, and you know, maybe it's not convenient for you to meet on campus, still look into this about doing it remotely. And you can find them at writing.ucdavis.edu, grad writing consultations. Okay. So that does it for my PowerPoint, my presentation. We end a little bit early, and then we ask you to, if you would take a survey. It's kind of just like an evaluation. If you guys have taught, you are familiar with these. So I'm gonna post right now a link into the chat. Everyone should be able to see, that takes you to a survey form. Filling these out, it's just super helpful for us to know what works, what didn't work. So you should see the chat there. I will follow up with GradPathways to see if they recorded it, how you would access that recording, should you want it. And again, I recorded it just in case they didn't. So if you have questions about anything I talked about, feel free to hang out for a minute and ask. I'm going to turn the recording off, but then feel free to ask questions. Otherwise, please take the survey, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.